In 1986, the Dutch government finished building one of the largest coastal barriers ever constructed. 80 kilometers of steel, concrete, and engineered earth stretching across the mouth of the Eastern Scheldt estuary in the Netherlands. It took 12 years to build. It cost more than the moon landing, adjusted for scale. It was designed to protect 350,000 people from North Sea flooding, and it worked. The water stayed out. The people were safe. By every engineering measure, the project was a complete success. But within a few years, something else was happening, something nobody had modeled, something the engineers hadn't planned for. The estuary, one of the most ecologically rich tidal systems in all of Europe, was slowly dying. Not from pollution, not from warming, not from any of the threats scientists typically watched for. It was dying because the wall had worked too well. Sediment was vanishing. Mudflats were disappearing. Species that had lived in that estuary for thousands of years were declining at a rate that alarmed researchers across the continent. And the strangest part, the people who built the wall had actually predicted this might happen. They had been warned. They had even redesigned the entire structure to try to prevent it, and it still wasn't enough. This is the story of the Eastern Scheldt, the storm surge barrier that changed how the world thinks about building walls against the sea. The Netherlands has always had a complicated relationship to the sea. For centuries, the Dutch have pushed back against it, draining lakes, building dikes, reclaiming land that was once ocean floor. But in February 1953, the sea pushed back. A catastrophic storm surge struck the southwestern coast of the Netherlands. Water levels rose nearly 5 meters above normal. Dikes collapsed. Villages flooded in hours. 1,836 people died in a single night. It remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern European history. The government's response was immediate and decisive. They launched the Delta Works, a massive national program to seal off the river delta inlets of the southwestern Netherlands from the North Sea. Dam after dam was built across the estuary mouths. Most were straightforward closures. Fill them in. Block the water. Done. But when engineers reached the Eastern Scheldt, the Oosterschelde, they ran into a problem they hadn't fully anticipated. The estuary wasn't just water, it was alive. The Eastern Scheldt was one of the most productive marine ecosystems in all of Europe. Oyster farmers had worked its waters for generations. Fishermen depended on it entirely. And beneath the surface, the tidal mudflats supported millions of migratory birds, juvenile fish, and rare invertebrates found almost nowhere else on the continent. A full closure would destroy all of it. Scientists said so directly, fishermen said so loudly, and for once, the government actually listened. Instead of sealing the estuary completely, engineers were sent back to the drawing board. What they came up with was something the world had never seen before, and it would take 12 years and billions of guilders to build. But the question nobody fully answered, not then, not yet, was whether it would actually. The new design was unlike anything that had ever been attempted. Instead of a solid dam, engineers proposed a barrier with gates, 62 massive steel gates, each one the size of a house, suspended between concrete piers stretching across the mouth of the estuary. Under normal conditions, the gates would stay open, the tide would still flow in and out, the ecosystem would still breathe. But when a major storm approached, the gates would close, blocking the surge before it could reach the land behind. It was an elegant compromise, protection without destruction. The Dutch called it the Oosterschelde. Construction began in 1976 and consumed nearly a decade of labor, engineering innovation, and national resources. Specialized ships were built just for this project. Concrete piers weighing 18,000 tons each were floated into position on the estuary floor. It was, by any measure, one of the most complex engineering projects ever completed in peacetime. When Queen Beatrix officially closed the final gate in October 1986, the country celebrated. Engineers had done what politicians promised. The estuary was protected. The ecosystem was saved, or so everyone believed. Within 3 years, researchers began noticing something they couldn't immediately explain. The mudflats, the shallow, silty edges of the estuary where so much of the ecosystem's life was concentrated, were getting smaller. Not dramatically at first, just a few centimeters lower than expected, easy to dismiss as natural variation. But a marine biologist working for the Dutch government's water authority kept measuring, and the numbers kept moving in the same direction. The mudflats weren't fluctuating, they were shrinking. And the reason why would take years to fully understand. And when it finally became clear, It reframed the entire project. The answer had to do with something most people never think about: sand. Not the kind on a beach. The fine, suspended particles, silt, and sediment that the tides carry in and out of an estuary with every single cycle. In a natural estuary, the tide rushes in twice a day with enormous energy. It stirs up sediment from the seabed, carries it inland, and deposits it across the mudflats. That process, repeated hundreds of thousands of times over centuries, is what built those mudflats in the first place. But the barrier had changed the tidal energy inside the estuary. Not eliminated it, just reduced it. The gates were open most of the time, but the barrier's concrete piers were blocking roughly a third of the original tidal flow. Less flow meant less energy. Less energy meant less sediment being carried in from the sea. And without that constant replenishment, the mudflats were slowly deflating, compacting under their own weight, sinking centimeter by centimeter, year by year. The researchers called it sediment starvation, and the consequences were cascading in ways nobody had fully modeled. Mudflats are not just mud. They are feeding grounds for hundreds of thousands of migratory wading birds that pass through the Eastern Scheldt every year. As the flats shrank, the birds had less area to forage. Populations of bar-tailed godwits, dunlins, and knots, birds that fly thousands of kilometers between Africa and the Arctic, began declining in the estuary. Oyster beds, the same ones the fishermen had fought to protect, started showing stress. The ecosystem that the barrier was designed to save was unraveling anyway, just more slowly and more quietly. But what came next, what researchers discovered when they looked even deeper, changed the entire conversation. When researchers began pulling historical records, they found something that stopped them cold. The sediment starvation hadn't started in 1986. It had started in 1976, the moment construction began. Even before the barrier was finished, the estuary had begun changing. The presence of construction, the dredging, the concrete piers being lowered into position, the disruption of the seabed, had already begun altering tidal patterns in ways nobody had measured in real time. By the time the gates closed for the first time, the estuary had already lost a decade of sediment replenishment. The barrier hadn't triggered the problem. It had inherited one that was already running, but there was something else in those records, something that made the researchers go quiet. In the original environmental assessments from the early 1970s, documents that had been reviewed, approved, and filed away, there was a section on sediment dynamics. A Dutch hydraulic engineer named Dr. Johan Vroon had flagged the risk directly. He had written in precise technical language that reducing tidal flow by even 30% could trigger long-term sediment deficits in the estuary. He had recommended further modeling before construction proceeded. His recommendation had been noted, and then the project moved forward anyway. Not out of negligence, not out of corruption, but because in 1976, the memory of 1953 was still raw. Flood protection wasn't a policy debate. It was a moral obligation. The engineers had made a choice between two kinds of loss, and they had chosen the one they could live with. But now, decades later, a new generation of scientists was inheriting that choice, and they were beginning to ask a question that had no comfortable answer. Could any of this still be reversed? The answer, it turned out, was yes, but not in the way anyone expected. Dutch water managers and ecologists spent years debating options. Removing the barrier was never seriously considered. The flood risk hadn't gone away. If anything, with sea levels rising, the barrier had become more critical than ever. So engineers looked at the problem from the other direction. Instead of changing the barrier, could they change what was happening inside the estuary? In 2019, the Dutch government launched a sediment supplementation program. Dredging vessels began carefully redistributing sand and silt onto the most depleted mudflat areas. It was painstaking, expensive work, and it wasn't a cure. It was maintenance, like topping off a tank that would always be slowly draining, but it worked well enough to stabilize several critical feeding areas. Bird populations in those zones stopped declining. Oyster farmers reported modest recovery in specific beds. The estuary hadn't been restored, but it had been held in place. Then came the detail that reframed everything. When researchers published their long-term findings in 2021, they noted something unexpected in the data. The estuary, despite decades of sediment starvation, had not collapsed, it had adapted. Certain species had shifted their behavior, using what mudflat remained more efficiently. The ecosystem had reorganized around its new constraints. It was diminished, but it was still functioning. What the Eastern Scheldt taught the scientific community was something engineers had never fully accounted for in their models. Ecosystems are not static. They absorb change. They renegotiate their own balance. And sometimes the damage you cause is not the damage you predicted. The Eastern Scheldt still stands today. It has closed its gates fewer than 24 times in 40 years. Each closure has protected hundreds of thousands of people from flooding. And each year, a small team of researchers continues measuring the mudflats, watching, adjusting, learning. The wall did what it was built to do. The sea stayed out. But the estuary on the other side of that wall became something new. Not what it was. Not what anyone planned. Something in between. And perhaps that is the most honest outcome any large intervention in nature can produce. If this kind of story makes you think differently about how the world works, consider subscribing. There are more of them waiting.